I still had cemetery dirt clinging to the heel of my black shoes when Bryce Hale handed me the envelope. Behind us, workers were lowering my motor into the ground, while the church choir softly sang Amazing Grace beneath a gray Charleston sky. The air smelled like wet grass, lilies, and cold rain. My head was pounding from 3 sleepless weeks of hospice care, funeral planning, and pretending I was stronger than I felt. People kept touching my arm gently as they walked past. She was such a beautiful woman. She raised an incredible daughter. We're praying for you. And right in the middle of all that grief, Bryce stepped in front of me wearing a tailored navy overcoat and the same polished expression he used during investor meetings. No warmth, no hesitation, just a white envelope in his hand. "At least read it before Monday," he said quietly. For a second, I honestly thought my brain had stopped working properly. I stared at him, trying to understand why my 33-year-old stepson looked more nervous than sympathetic. Then I looked past him. My husband, Richard, stood near the row of black SUVs with both hands buried deep inside his coat pockets. He didn't walk toward me, didn't interrupt Bryce, didn't even look me in the eye. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not because I knew I was losing my position at the company, but because I realized they had planned this before my mother was even buried. I opened the envelope in the back seat of the car while rain tapped softly against the windows. Termination paperwork, executive restructuring notice, immediate removal from operational authority at Hale and Ritter Hospitality Group. 16 years reduced to 6 cold pages written by corporate attorneys. No thank you, no acknowledgement, no mention of the years I spent helping build the company beside Richard after his first wife died and the business nearly collapsed. Just legal language. My chest tightened so hard I thought I might actually get sick. Richard climbed into the driver's seat a minute later without speaking. He smelled faintly like cigar smoke and rainwater. "We can talk at home," he said quietly. Somehow that hurt more than the paperwork, because it sounded rehearsed, like he'd been practicing the sentence long before today. The drive back to Charleston felt endless. Water streaked across the windshield while Richard kept talking about investor expansion and necessary modernization. I barely heard him. I kept thinking about my mother, about how she used to sit in the front row during every charity gala I organized for the hotels. She loved watching people dance under those crystal chandeliers like life still held beautiful things worth dressing up for. My mother believed hospitality mattered because loneliness was becoming an epidemic in America. She used to say older people could feel when the world stopped seeing them. Maybe that was why the company mattered so much to me. It was never just hotels. It was anniversaries, funeral receptions, retirement dinners, widows traveling alone after losing husbands, families reuniting after years apart. People remember how you made them feel long after they forget what you charged them. I'd said that once during a board dinner 6 months earlier. Bryce laughed. "Sentiment doesn't scale," he told me, while the investors around him smiled politely. At the time, Richard said nothing. Now I realized silence had become his favorite language. Halfway home, I finally asked the question burning inside me. "How long did you know?" Richard kept his eyes on the road. "That doesn't matter now." My stomach dropped. Because people only answer questions like that when the truth is worse than the lie. "How long?" I repeated. He exhaled slowly. "The restructuring paperwork was approved earlier this week. 3 days. They approved my removal 3 days before I buried my mother." I turned toward the window so he wouldn't see my face break apart. When we got home, I walked straight into the kitchen and stood there staring at the casserole dish, still sitting on the counter from the hospice volunteers. The house suddenly felt unfamiliar. Too quiet, too clean without oxygen tanks and medication schedules and nurses whispering down the hallway. My phone buzzed repeatedly. At first, I ignored it. Then I looked down. Messages from employees. Some short, some terrified. "I'm so sorry. We didn't know how to tell you. One simply read, "They started locking files before the funeral even began." I felt cold all over. I grabbed my laptop and tried logging into the Punsanity system. Access denied. Again, access denied. Even my executive archive permissions were gone. That was when panic finally pushed through the grief. Not because I wanted my title back. Because Bryce moved too fast. People only erase things that quickly when they're afraid someone might stop them. An hour later, another message appeared from a junior or operations manager who must have accidentally sent it to my old email chain before realizing I'd been removed. Attached was an internal staffing schedule. Dozens of longtime employees marked for retirement transition. Replacement labor contractors already assigned. Older workers pushed out first. I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred. Then something else caught my attention. A file reference buried near the bottom of the attachment. Asset liquidation. Harbor House property. My pulse stopped. Harbor House wasn't just another hotel. It was the historic coastal property my mother spent years helping preserve through community fundraising events. And suddenly I understood. This was never only about firing me. Something much uglier was already happening inside the company I helped build. I went back to the flagship hotel 3 days later because grief has a strange way of making you search for familiar places even after they stop belonging to you. The morning air in downtown Charleston felt heavy with humidity as I pulled into the employee garage just after entrances. For 16 years, I'd walked through those surface house entrances before most guests woke up. I knew which elevator stuck between floors during storms, which concierge secretly kept dog treats behind the desk for repeat guests, which ballroom lights flickered during summer heat waves. I used to know everything. Now I felt like a stranger sneaking into someone else's memory. One of the younger valet attendants spotted me climbing out of my car. His smile appeared automatically before disappearing almost immediately. "Morning, Mrs. Hale," he said quietly. Then he looked around nervously like someone might punish him for speaking to me. That hurt more than I expected. Inside the lobby, I stopped walking altogether. The hotel smelled different. For years, every Hale and Ritter property carried the same signature scent in the mornings: magnolia, cinnamon, and fresh coffee. Warm, familiar, human. Now the air smelled cold and expensive, like designer perfume sprayed over marble floors. The lobby itself had changed too. Bryce removed the floral arrangements from the front desk and replaced them with towering digital screens promoting luxury reimagined. The old velvet reading chairs near the fireplace were gone. So were the local watercolor paintings from Charleston artists. Everything looked sleek and completely lifeless. I stood there long enough for a young executive assistant I didn't recognize to approach me carefully. "Can I help you?" I almost laughed. 6 months earlier, I'd approved the redesigned budget for her entire department. "I'm just here for my things," I said. The executive hallway upstairs felt colder somehow. Too quiet, too polished. And then I saw it. The leadership wall. Photographs of every executive who helped build Hale and Ritter lined the corridor in black frames beneath soft gold lighting. Richard's picture remained in the center. Bryce's new corporate portrait had already been added beside his. Mine was gone. The empty rectangle where my photograph used to hang was still visible because the wallpaper behind it hadn't faded yet. I just stood there staring at the outline like a ghost had been ripped from the wall. 16 years erased in less than a week. My office door was already open when I reached it. Every drawer emptied, every shelf cleared. My entire professional life packed into identical white archive boxes stacked neatly beside the desk. Prepared too quickly, too efficiently, which meant they started before the funeral. "You always did hate clutter." Bryce's voice startled me from the doorway. He leaned casually against the frame wearing a charcoal suit without a wrinkle anywhere on it. Calm, composed, controlled. I suddenly realized I had never once seen him look uncertain in public, not even as a child. "I suppose dead weight counts as clutter now too," I said. His jaw tightened slightly. "We're restructuring the company for long-term survival. I folded my arms. By firing everyone over 50? That's not what's happening. Really? Because Lorraine from housekeeping cried room yesterday after being pressured into retirement. Something flickered across his face then. Annoyance, maybe, or guilt. It disappeared fast. You're emotionally attached to outdated business models, he said evenly. Hospitality is evolving. Investors want scalable luxury experiences, not sentimental traditions. I stared at him for several seconds because I genuinely couldn't understand how Richard's son became so disconnected from people. The people were the business, I said quietly. Bryce gave a small shrug. Not anymore. That sentence followed me all afternoon. Not anymore. As if kindness itself had become financially inconvenient, I spent the next hour walking through service corridors collecting the last pieces of my office. Old gala binders, framed event photos, handwritten guest thank you notes I could never throw away. Most employees avoided eye contact entirely. Fear changes workplace energy faster than anything else. Near the laundry department, I found Lorraine sitting alone beside rolling carts filled with towels. She'd worked for the company nearly 23 years. Her hands shook while folding sheets. "They're cutting my hours again," she whispered before I even sat beside her. They said maybe retirement would be easier. Lorraine was 62 years old and helping raise 2 grandchildren after her daughter's addiction relapse. Retirement wasn't an option. They said guests prefer younger staff now, she added quietly. Something inside me snapped a little hearing that. Not explosive anger. Just heartbreak so deep it turned cold. Because women like Lorraine spent decades making strangers feel welcome while nobody noticed how exhausted they were becoming themselves. And suddenly they were considered too old to matter. Later that afternoon, Elena Morales pulled me into the kitchen storage room before anyone could see us talking. She wrapped both arms around me so tightly I almost cried right there between industrial shelves, stacked with canned tomatoes and dry pasta. "You look exhausted," she whispered. "So do you." Elena laughed softly without humor. Brights' cut night kitchen staffing again. Her face darkened. "He's obsessed with impressing those New York investors." Then she handed me a folded printout. An internal executive email. I unfolded it slowly. Guest emotional engagement metrics no longer justify legacy staffing costs. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. Like maybe the words would become less ugly if I stared long enough. "They're measuring warmth like it's a financial liability now," Elena whispered. I felt sick. That evening, Richard was waiting in his study when I got home. He barely looked up from the investor reports spread across his desk. "You shouldn't be talking to employees behind Bryce's back," he said immediately. Not, "How are you holding up?" Not, "I'm sorry," just business. I stared at him across the room, suddenly seeing a man I barely recognized. "When did this company become more important to you than people?" I asked quietly. Richard rubbed his forehead tiredly. "You're taking this personally." I almost laughed again. Personally, as if 16 years of sacrifice and loyalty were just emotional inconveniences now. That night, I searched Harbor House property records online until nearly 2 in the morning, and finally I found it. A shell corporation connected to Bryce's investors had quietly filed acquisition paperwork tied to the land beneath Harbor House. My pulse began pounding immediately. Because Harbor House wasn't being modernized, it was being prepared for sale. Just as I leaned from the screen, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered carefully. An older woman's voice trembled softly on the other end. "Mrs. Hale?" "Yes?" "My husband and I had our 50th anniversary reservation canceled this morning." Her voice cracked. "We've stayed at Harbor House every year since 1996. I closed my eyes. "I'm so sorry." There was a long silence before she spoke again. "Your hotels used to make people feel like they mattered." After the call ended, I sat alone in the dark kitchen for a very long time. Because for the first time, I realized this story was no longer about losing my place inside the Hale family. It was about watching an entire legacy lose its soul. I barely slept after the phone call from the anniversary couple. Around 6 in the morning, I gave up pretending and walked into the kitchen wearing one of Richard's old college sweatshirts. The house still carried traces of my mother everywhere. Her favorite tea tin sat beside the stove. One of her crossword books remained open on the dining table, exactly where she left it before hospice care began. Grief changes shape when anger enters it. At first, losing someone feels like drowning. Then one day, you wake up furious that the world kept moving afterward. My phone rang just as the coffee machine started brewing. Arthur Bennett, I answered immediately. Mrs. Hale, he said softly. I'm sorry to bother you again. You're not bothering me. There was a long pause before he spoke again. My wife cried herself to sleep last night. That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Arthur and Jean Bennett had stayed at Harbor House every October for nearly 30 years. I remembered helping Arthur secretly arrange a second wedding ceremony there after Jean finished breast cancer treatments almost a decade earlier. He rented the entire rooftop garden and filled it with white roses, because Jean once mentioned she never had flowers at their first wedding. Those were the kinds of memories our hotels used to protect. Now Bryce had canceled their 50th anniversary reservation to make room for cryptocurrency investors drinking $1,200 whiskey beneath imported chandeliers. I'm trying to fix this, I told him quietly. Arthur sighed. I don't think this is just about reservations anymore. After we hung up, I sat there staring into my coffee while the morning sunlight slowly crept across the kitchen floor. And for the first time since the funeral, my grief started turning into purpose. Charleston felt different that week. You could feel tension spreading through the city, the way people sense storms before rain arrives. At a cafe near Meeting Street, two older women whispered about Harbor House while folding shopping bags. A tour guide joked awkwardly about corporate changes outside one of our historic properties. Even the florist who supplied our hotel lobbies looked uncomfortable when I walked inside. People were talking. Not loudly yet, but enough. Near lunchtime, I stopped outside the flagship hotel to drop off paperwork for Elena. One of the younger valets hurried toward me before anyone could notice. Mrs. Hale, he whispered nervously. People are scared. I frowned. Scared of what? He glanced toward the hotel entrance before lowering his voice further. Bryce is turning this place into another soulless chain. Then he walked away quickly, like speaking honestly had become dangerous. That sentence stayed with me the rest of the afternoon, because he was right. Hospitality was never supposed to feel cold. People don't return to hotels because of marble countertops or luxury branding. They return because someone remembered their anniversary, their favorite room, the fact they lost a spouse last year and needed extra kindness without asking for it. Bryce understood business, but he understood nothing about loneliness. Over the next few days, former employees began contacting me quietly. Some met me in church parking lots, some in tiny diners outside Charleston, some cried before they even sat down. One former concierge named Malcolm stared down at his untouched coffee while twisting his wedding ring nervously. My wife died 3 years ago, he admitted quietly. That hotel was my whole life after that. I didn't know what to say. Because corporate restructuring reports never mention things like that. They never mention how workplaces become family for people who already buried too much. Then Malcolm told me something worse. Management said older guests aren't profitable enough anymore, he whispered. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course they did. A few nights later, Elena met me inside a small bakery after closing hours. The owner locked the front door behind me so nobody from the company would see us together. Elena looked exhausted, dark circles beneath her eyes, hands trembling slightly from stress. They're filtering complaint reports now, she said immediately. What do you mean filtering? Negative guest reviews are being intercepted before corporate records them publicly. My stomach tightened. Elena slid printed screenshots across the table. Internal management chats. One message read, Older repeat guests create emotionally high-maintenance service expectations. Another, focused staffing toward premium demographics under 55. I felt physically sick reading them, not because they were cruel, because nobody inside those conversations challenged them. Nobody. Elena rubbed both hands together anxiously. People are afraid to say anything now, she whispered. Managers are reporting conversations directly to Bryce. That night, Richard came home unusually early. For one dangerous second, I thought maybe he missed me. Maybe he finally understood how much damage had been done. Instead, he walked straight into the kitchen holding investor briefing documents. "You need to stop talking to employees," he said flatly. I stared at him in disbelief. "That's what you came home to say? You're making the situation worse." I laughed then, a small exhausted laugh that didn't sound like me anymore. "The situation?" I repeated. "Richard, your son, fired me during my mother's funeral." He rubbed his forehead impatiently. "Bryce is under enormous pressure, and what about me?" Silence. Always silence. Then he said something that finally broke whatever hope I still had left. "The investors are already nervous. Public rumors could destroy the expansion deal. Not our marriage, not our family, the deal." That was when I realized Richard still believed this crisis was financial. He still didn't understand the real damage had already happened. Later that night, an email arrived from an anonymous account. No message, just 3 attached financial documents. My pulse started racing before I even opened them. Transfer records, foundation accounts, shell corporations connected to Bryce's investors, and right there beside one authorization code near the bottom of the page was Richard's executive approval signature. I stared at the screen while rain battered the kitchen windows outside. My wedding photograph with Richard sat framed beside the lamp. For years, I believed silence meant loyalty. Now I finally understood silence could also mean permission. And suddenly, I wasn't wondering whether my husband failed to protect me anymore. I was wondering whether he helped destroy everything we once built together. The rain hadn't stopped by the time I met Naomi Pierce 3 days later. Charleston looked washed out beneath gray skies as I parked near the waterfront cafe she'd chosen for our meeting. Tourists hurried past holding umbrellas while the harbor water crashed softly against the docks outside. I almost turned around twice before walking in. For 16 years, my instincts had been trained to protect Hale and Ritter at all costs. Every public complaint, every scandal risk, every unhappy guest situation, I handled them quietly before they became headlines. Now I was sitting across from an investigative reporter with a folder full of financial documents tied to my own husband. Naomi arrived carrying a leather satchel soaked with rainwater. She looked nothing like the aggressive television reporters Bryce always complained about. No dramatic makeup, no performative sympathy, just tired eyes and sharp attention. "You came," she said simply. "I almost didn't. That usually means you already know something is wrong." I hated how accurate that sounded. For the next hour, Naomi walked me through shell corporations, investor transfers, and internal acquisition filings connected to Harbor House. Most of it felt overwhelming at first, until she slid one document across the table and tapped a highlighted paragraph. "Hale and Ritter has been moving foundation money quietly for almost a year," she said. I stared at the numbers: community preservation funds, charity accounts, historic restoration grants. Money my mother spent years helping raise through endless fundraising dinners and silent auctions. "She believed in that foundation," I whispered. Naomi's expression softened slightly. "I know." Then she handed me printed copies of internal executive emails recovered from one of Bryce's investor communications. I scanned the page once, then again slower. Sentimental liability, continue draining liquidity from high-value expansion opportunities. My chest tightened immediately. Sentimental liabilities. That was how Bryce described the foundation programs my mother practically gave her final healthy years helping support. I suddenly remembered her standing in Harbor House's ballroom 2 winters earlier, wearing a silver shawl over her shoulders while greeting donors with tired but genuine warmth. She'd been fighting cancer already, but she still showed up because she believed community mattered, and Bryce called people like her liabilities. Outside the cafe windows, rainwater streaked down the glass, while something inside me quietly hardened. Not rage, clarity. The story exploded faster than I expected after Naomi published her first article. Former employees began speaking anonymously about budget cuts and intimidation tactics. Local radio stations discussed Harbor House nonstop. Online reviews flooded social media from longtime guests, describing canceled anniversaries, vanished traditions, and cold treatment from new management. But the moment everything shifted emotionally came 3 nights later. I was sitting alone in the living room when a local news segment aired an interview with an elderly widow named Patricia Coleman. I recognized her immediately. Her husband used to bring her to Harbor House every spring before he passed away from Parkinson's disease. Patricia sat wrapped in a pale blue cardigan, twisting tissues nervously in her lap while cameras rolled. "That hotel helped me survive losing my husband," she said quietly. "After he died, the staff remembered my favorite tea every year without asking. They made me feel like somebody still expected me to come back." Her voice cracked slightly. "Now nobody even answers my calls anymore." I turned the television off after that because I couldn't bear hearing the rest. People weren't mourning a hotel, they were mourning kindness. 2 days later, Elena stopped answering my messages entirely. By evening, I drove across town in a panic and finally found her sitting alone in a grocery store parking lot staring out through her windshield. She looked exhausted, not physically, spiritually. "They fired me this morning," she said before I even reached the car. My stomach dropped. "For what?" Alina laughed bitterly. "Failure to align with evolving company culture." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Rain tapped against the roof, while shoppers pushed carts through puddles nearby, like the rest of the world still made sense. Then Elena suddenly broke down crying, not dramatic sobbing, just quiet exhaustion after months of fear. "I gave that kitchen 20 years," she whispered. 20 years. I climbed into the passenger seat and held her hand while she cried. Before I left, she shoved a wrapped napkin package into my coat pocket. "Don't open it here," she whispered. I waited until I got home. Inside the napkins was a flash drive. The files on it made my blood run cold. Executive staffing, property liquidation plans, investor pressure emails. And attached to several approvals near Bryce's name was Richard's digital authorization signature. Not accidental, not manipulated, approved. My husband knew everything. I sat at the kitchen table staring at those signatures until nearly midnight before another file caught my attention. Medical incident reimbursement request. Harbor House gala event. Confused, I opened it. My mother's name appeared halfway down the page. My hands started shaking immediately. Months before she died, she suffered a severe pain episode during one of the foundation charity events at Harbor House. Staffing shortages delayed medical response coordination because Bryce's executive restructuring had already reduced event personnel. Nobody told me. Nobody. I kept reading until one handwritten internal note nearly stopped my breathing completely. "Guest family not notified per executive discretion." I covered my mouth with both hands, not because I wanted to scream, because grief hit so hard I physically couldn't breathe for several seconds. While I spent years protecting that company, while I defended it, while I sacrificed my career for it, they quietly failed my mother inside the very place she helped save. The next morning, another leak hit social media. Someone recorded Bryce screaming during an executive meeting. If sentiment mattered more than numbers," he snapped in the recording, "none of you would even have jobs." The backlash became immediate. Investors panicked. Employees turned hostile. Local preservation groups demanded investigations. And around midnight that same night, noticed headlights outside my house. Richard sat alone inside his car, across the street with the engine running. He stayed there nearly 20 minutes without coming to the door, just watching the house, close enough to see my pain, too cowardly to step inside it. Before driving away, he left a voicemail. Only one sentence. Bryce is trying to sell its Harbor House before the board turns against him. I stared out the window long after his car disappeared. Then I looked toward the framed photograph of my mother standing proudly in front of Harbor House during one of the old charity galas. And for the first time, this stopped feeling like exposing corruption. It felt like trying to stop someone from burying every good thing my family once stood for. Charleston City Hall had never looked so crowded. News vans lined the street outside for sunrise. Former employees gathered beneath the courthouse steps clutching coffee cups and folded umbrellas while reporters chased nervous investors through the lobby. I sat alone in my car for nearly 10 minutes before forcing myself to get out. Part of me still couldn't believe any of this was happening. A month earlier, my biggest concern had been whether my mother was comfortable enough to sleep through the night without pain medication adjustments. Now the company I spent 16 years helping build was collapsing in public, and somehow I was standing in the middle of it. Inside the hearing room, rows of folding chairs filled quickly with former employees, preservation activists, longtime guests, and local business owners. The air buzzed with tension and whispered conversations. Then I noticed something unexpected. Photographs. People had brought old photographs from Harbor House, wedding pictures, anniversary dinners, faniversary dinners, retirement celebrations. An elderly woman near the front carefully held a faded photograph of herself dancing with her late husband beneath Harbor House's ballroom chandeliers sometime in the 1980s. That image nearly broke me, because Bryce thought he was selling real estate. But what people were actually fighting for were memories. The hearing began with testimony from former staff members. Lorraine spoke first. Her hands shook while she described being pressured into retirement after 23 years working housekeeping. "I trained 3 generations of staff in those hotels," she said softly. "Then suddenly I was too expensive to keep." The room fell silent. Another employee described managers instructing staff to prioritize premium demographics over elderly repeat guests. Then Patricia Coleman, the widow from the television interview, slowly walked to the microphone using a cane. "You know what people don't understand about getting older?" she asked quietly. "One day you realize most places stopped expecting you to return." My throat tightened immediately. Patricia looked directly toward the council members. "That hotel used to remember my name after my husband died," she whispered. "You have no idea what that means to lonely people." Several people in the audience started crying, including me, because suddenly this wasn't about corruption anymore. It was about dignity, about whether older people still deserved spaces that treated them like they mattered. When they finally called my name, the entire room turned toward me at once. For a second, I couldn't move. Then I saw my mother's old silver bracelet wrapped around my wrist and forced myself forward. The microphone trembled slightly beneath my hands. "I spent 16 years helping run Hale and Ritter Hospitality," I began quietly, "and I think somewhere along the way, we forgot what hospitality was supposed to mean." The room became still. I talked about lonely widows traveling alone after funerals, about anniversary couples returning every year to reconnect with memories, about employees who spent decades making strangers feel safe and welcome. "People return to places where they once felt cared for," I said softly, and suddenly I saw several older women in the audience nodding through tears. Then I told them about my mother, how she helped raise money to preserve Harbor House, because she believed communities needed places that held emotional history. I didn't tell them the worst part. I didn't mention the delayed medical response or the hidden report. Some grief felt too sacred to turn into public ammunition. When Bryce finally entered the hearing room nearly 40 minutes late, the energy shifted instantly. He arrived surrounded by lawyers and investors wearing another perfectly tailored suit that suddenly looked strangely small on him, not physically, emotionally. For the first time since all this started, Bryce looked tired. The council questioned him aggressively about staffing cuts, hidden complaints, and foundation transfers. At first, he answered smoothly using polished corporate language. Then an older doorman named Frank stood from the audience unexpectedly. Frank worked at Harbor House for 31 years. He looked directly at Bryce and asked one simple question: "Do you even know any of the guests' names anymore?" Bryce opened his mouth, then stopped, because he couldn't answer. The silence afterward felt brutal. Something inside Bryce visibly cracked after that, not dramatically. Just enough for people to finally see the frightened man underneath the executive mask. "I spent my whole life trying to prove myself inside that company," he said finally, voice unsteady. "Every room I walked into, employees trusted Vanessa more than me." He looked toward me briefly before lowering his eyes. "She made people feel important naturally. I thought if I made the company bigger, people would finally respect me." For the first time, I didn't see Bryce as cruel. I saw someone emotionally starving himself, trying to earn love through power. That didn't excuse what he did, but it made him human again. Richard spoke next, and somehow that hurt worst of all. Because for the first time in decades, nobody in the room cared about his reputation. An elderly guest interrupted him halfway through his statement. "You stopped acting like an owner years ago," she said sharply. "Owners care when people are hurting." Richard looked stunned, like nobody had spoken to him honestly in years. Then something inside him finally seemed to collapse. He admitted he ignored Breese's behavior because he feared losing his son completely after years of emotional distance between them. "I thought protecting him meant avoiding conflict," Richard said quietly. His voice sounded older than I'd ever heard it, but all I really did was teach him that silence excuses damage. The investors expected me to demand revenge after that. I could feel it. They expected public destruction, executives removed, scandal weaponized. Instead, I stood again and proposed something entirely different: a community partnership model, employee oversight, historic preservation boards, guest advocacy protections, systems designed to stop one frightened Faye from controlling everything again. And for the first time that day, the room applauded. Not for me, for hope. Late that night, I returned alone to Harbor House. The lobby sat almost empty beneath dim chandeliers when I noticed someone near the reception desk. Bryce, no suit jacket, no executives, no performance. Just Bryce helping an elderly couple whose luggage had been lost after staffing shortages caused scheduling chaos. The husband looked confused and exhausted. Early dementia, maybe. Bryce personally carried their bags upstairs, then sat beside the man in the lobby for nearly 20 minutes helping calm him while his wife quietly cried from embarrassment. He never noticed me watching, and somehow that mattered more than any apology could have. The next morning, Richard walked into the emergency board meeting, looking 20 years older. Then he cleared his throat and quietly announced his resignation as CEO. Gas filled the room instantly, but his final sentence stunned everyone into silence. "Harbor House will not be sold." And for the first time in months, I felt something besides grief inside me. Not victory, just the fragile possibility that maybe something honest could still survive the wreckage. A year later, I drove past a Hale and Ritter billboard just outside Charleston and almost didn't recognize it. The old slogan used to say "luxury without limits." Now it read, "Hospitality begins with humanity." I actually laughed a little when I saw it. Not because it was funny, because it took the company nearly collapsing in public to finally understand something my mother had known her entire life. People never remember the marble floors. They remember how you made them feel when their world was falling apart. The ocean air drifted through my open windows as I continued down the coastal highway toward Harbor House. Morning sunlight shimmered across the water, soft and gold, and for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't driving toward a crisis. That still felt strange. For nearly 2 decades, my phone ruled my life. Someone always needed something: a guest complaint, a staffing emergency, a fundraising disaster, an executive meeting. A marriage quietly unraveling while I pretended not to notice. Peace felt unnatural at first. Then slowly, it started feeling like oxygen. Hale and Ritter survived the scandal, though barely. Several investors pulled out completely after the hearing. Expansion projects died almost overnight. 3 luxury acquisitions were canceled. The company lost millions trying to rebuild public trust. But Harbor House stayed standing. That mattered more to me than any financial report ever could. The new community partnership model changed everything. Former employees now sat on advisory boards beside executives. Historic preservation leaders had oversight protections written directly into contracts. Guest staff's advocacy programs became mandatory across every property. And perhaps most importantly, older employees stopped being treated like disposable expenses. Lorraine came back 6 months after the hearing, not as housekeeping staff, as training director. The first time I visited after her return, I watched 22-year-old hospitality interns taking notes while Lorraine explained how to properly comfort grieving guests without making them feel pitied. She stood taller than I'd seen her in years. Sometimes dignity changes people physically. I parked outside Harbor House and sat there quietly for a moment before going inside. The building looked smaller now somehow, warmer too, less like an empire, more like a place human beings actually belonged in again. The lobby smelled like magnolias and cinnamon for the first time in over a year. That nearly broke me all over again. A young front desk's employee smiled warmly as I walked in. "Welcome back, Miss Hale." Not Mrs. Hale, Miss Hale. I didn't realize how badly I needed my own name back until that moment. Richard and I finalized the divorce 8 months earlier. Quietly. No public war, no dramatic courtroom scenes. Just two exhausted people finally admitting love cannot survive forever without honesty. I saw him occasionally now, usually at community business events or preservation fundraisers. The first time after the divorce, he looked painfully uncomfortable. Sitting across from me at a charity luncheon, neither of us wanted to leave early, but eventually something softened between us. Not romance, recognition. He finally stopped speaking like a CEO and started speaking like a man who understood regret. He moved into a smaller historic home outside Charleston after resigning. No private drivers, no executive staff, no constant meetings, just silence, the kind he spent years hiding from. One afternoon months earlier, we sat together on his back porch drinking iced tea while cicadas buzzed through the trees. I thought protecting the company meant protecting the family, he admitted quietly. I looked out toward the marshlands instead of answering. Then he said something I still think about sometimes. The truth is, I was so afraid of disappointing Bryce that I kept disappointing you instead. There are apologies that arrive late to fix anything, but they still matter. I forgave Richard eventually, not because he earned everything back, but because carrying anger forever felt too much like continuing the marriage alone. Bryce changed more slowly. Honestly, part of me thought he would run away after the scandal. But he didn't. That surprised everyone. The board stripped most of his executive authority after Richard resigned. He ended up managing the company's smallest coastal property nearly 2 hours outside Charleston under heavy oversight. At first, employees hated him openly. Some still do. But Bryce stayed anyway. He worked night shifts when staffing fell short. Personally answered guest complaints. Helped clean banquet halls after weddings because labor budgets were tighter now. For the first time in his life, he experienced hospitality as work instead of strategy. A few months earlier, Elena called me after visiting Bryce's property unexpectedly. "You know what he was doing when I got there?" she asked. "What?" "Fixing an ice machine at 11:30 at night because maintenance was short-staffed." I laughed softly. Not because it was funny, because old Bryce would have considered manual labor a branding problem. Then Elena said something quieter. He's trying, Vanessa's. I didn't answer immediately, because redemption is complicated when damage was real. A week later, I visited the property myself without warning. Bryce didn't notice me standing near the lobby entrance at first. He was helping an elderly widower who accidentally booked travel dates wrong after confusing the months during online reservations. The man looked embarrassed and overwhelmed. Bryce sat beside him patiently for almost half an hour, rearranging transportation, securing another room, and even bringing him hot tea afterward. No cameras, no investors, no performance. The guest never recognized the Hale name, which meant Bryce finally learned how to help someone without needing power in return. That mattered. As for me, I never returned to Hale and Ritter officially. Instead, I started Whitmore Hospitality Ethics Consulting. The name still feels strange sometimes. Mine, not attached to a husband, not hidden behind someone else's legacy, just mine. I spent the next year helping smaller family-owned hotels build healthier workplace systems before greed and fear could poison them the way they poisoned us. And unexpectedly, letters started arriving. Women in their 50s, 60s, even 70s, widows, former caregivers, recently divorced women, women forced into retirement who thought life had already passed them by. One handwritten letter from Arizona stayed pinned above my desk for months. It said, "Thank you for reminding me I'm not invisible yet." I cried reading that one. Because I think women like us spend so much of our lives making ourselves useful to everyone else that we forget we were supposed to matter too. That evening, Harbor House hosted its official reopening celebration under the new partnership structure. Nothing extravagant. Local musicians played jazz near the lawn overlooking the water, while families wandered through the gardens carrying champagne glasses and paper dessert plates. It felt real again. Not polished. Human. As the sun started setting, I wandered quietly through the lobby and froze beside the donor wall. My mother's photograph hung there near the center. Small, simple, elegant. No giant dedication plaque. Just a quiet acknowledgement that she helped save this place long before anyone realized it needed saving. I touched the edge of the frame gently. Then an older woman approached beside me, holding her husband's hand. "We came here after my chemotherapy treatments years ago," she said softly. "This hotel made me feel normal again when nothing else did." Tears filled her eyes as she looked around the lobby. "It finally feels like that again." After she walked away, I stood there for a long time trying not to cry in public. Because after everything, the thing I fought for survived. Not the empire, not the money, the humanity. Later that night, after most guests had gone home, I stepped outside alone and looked back at Harbor House glowing warmly against the dark coastline. For years, I thought saving something meant holding it together no matter how badly it hurt you. But sometimes saving something allowing the wrong version of it to fall apart, so the better version finally has room to exist. And honestly, I think a lot of people reach a moment in life where they realize loyalty only matters when it goes both ways. So, if you've ever been pushed aside by people you sacrificed everything for, or if you've ever had to rebuild your life after discovering your kindness was being taken for granted, I'd really love to hear your story in the comments. And if this story stayed with you until the end, please like the video, share it with Dansku, some trusted with someone who still believes that the matters more than power, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about family, betrayal, dignity, and second chances. Because sometimes the quietest people are carrying the heaviest stories.